Chardon, Ohio, sits squarely in the snowbelt of the Great Lakes region, a geographic designation that shapes the daily rhythm of life for its residents. Located about 30 miles east of Cleveland, it is the county seat of Geauga County, a place defined by its harsh winters and its deep agricultural roots. This is maple syrup country, the heart of an industry that celebrates the slow, steady tapping of trees when the winter thaw begins. It is a community where tradition holds weight, centered around a historic courthouse square that looks like it was lifted from a postcard of mid-century America. For the 5,000 people who call Chardon home, and the surrounding rural townships that feed into it, the town represents safety, stability, and a quiet sort of prosperity. It is the kind of place where families stay for generations, where the high school football team is the center of Friday night conversation, and where crime is usually relegated to minor disputes or property theft. Violence, particularly the lethal kind, feels foreign here, something that happens in the dense urban centers to the west, not among the rolling hills and snow-covered maples of Geauga County. In February 2012, the winter had been characteristically gray and cold. The snow piled high against the curbs, and the sky often hung low and heavy over the town square. Chardon High School served as a central hub for the area's teenagers, a sprawling brick complex that drew students from the city and the surrounding rural areas. It was a place of routine. The morning ritual was the same for hundreds of students. The groggy exit from yellow buses, the trudge through the slush, and the gathering in the cafeteria or the hallways before the first bell. This period, known as Zero Period, or simply the morning gathering, was a time for socialization, a buffer between the freedom of the weekend and the structure of the academic week. It was a loud, chaotic, and entirely normal ecosystem of adolescence, navigating the social hierarchies of high school. Into this ecosystem stepped Thomas T.J. Lane III, a 17-year-old who existed on the periphery of the Chardon High School experience. Lane was not a full-time student at Chardon High. He attended Lake Academy in nearby Willoughby, an alternative school designed for students who struggled in traditional academic settings or had behavioral issues. However, the logistics of the school district meant that Lane, like other alternative school students, took the bus to Chardon High in the morning to transfer to the transport that would take him to Lake Academy. This gap in transit left him waiting in the Chardon High cafeteria, a transient figure in a sea of red and black school colors. He was physically present but institutionally separated, a dynamic that often leaves students feeling like ghosts haunting a building where they do not truly belong. Lane's background was a fracture in the otherwise cohesive image of the community, though not uniquely so. Domestic troubles exist everywhere, even in quiet towns. He lived with his grandparents, who had been granted custody due to a turbulent history involving his biological parents. His father had a lengthy criminal record involving violence against women and law enforcement, a shadow that loomed over the family narrative. TJ himself was often described by those who knew him as quiet, introverted, and soft-spoken. He was slender, with dark hair and a pale complexion, often keeping to himself during those transfer periods in the cafeteria. To the casual observer, he was just another teenager in a hoodie, waiting for a bus, perhaps a bit withdrawn but hardly a figure of terror. He did not have a reputation for bullying or overt aggression at school. In fact, some acquaintances described him as kind or simply reserved. However, beneath the surface of this quiet demeanor, a digital portrait was emerging that contradicted the silence he projected in person. In the weeks leading up to late February, Lane's online presence had darkened. On Facebook, he posted cryptic, poetic ramblings that hinted at a profound sense of alienation and a fascination with misery. He wrote of a man with a hammer and touched on themes of solitude and death. One particularly chilling post, written in December 2011, ended with the phrase, "Die, all of you." These posts were accessible to his peers, yet in the deluge of teenage angst that floods social media, they were largely interpreted as cries for attention or artistic expressions of emo culture, rather than specific threats of violence. The disconnect between the quiet boy waiting for the bus and the seething narrator of his online life was absolute. The community saw the mask, not the face beneath it. At Lake Academy, Lane was considered an average student, recognized for his intelligence, but noted for his lack of motivation. He was not a pariah. He had friends, he socialized, and he had recently broken up with a girlfriend, a common enough tragedy in the life of a 17-year-old. There were no flashing red lights in his school file that screamed imminent danger to the administration. He was not on a watch list for school shooters. He was simply a boy from a broken home trying to finish his education in an alternative setting. This invisibility was his camouflage. Because he was not a constant presence in the Chardon classrooms, he was not subject to the daily scrutiny of the Chardon teachers. He was a visitor in the cafeteria, a face in the crowd that didn't quite register as a threat. Monday, the 27th of February 2012, began like any other Monday in the snowbelt. The temperatures were freezing, the roads were wet, and the students of Chardon High filtered into the building with the usual mix of fatigue and energy. The cafeteria was the epicenter of activity. Tables were claimed by different social groups, an unspoken map of teenage alliances. At one table sat a group of boys, some of whom were waiting for the bus to the Auburn Career Center, a vocational school. They were laughing, talking, perhaps copying homework or discussing the weekend. It was the definition of a soft target, a place of relaxation and low awareness. The faculty monitors were present, coffee in hand, watching the crowd, but their focus was on food fights or loud arguments, not lethal violence. T.J. Lane arrived at the school on the bus as usual. He entered the cafeteria, wearing a gray t-shirt with a black sweatshirt over it. He carried a backpack. Inside that backpack, or perhaps concealed on his person, was a .22 caliber Ruger Mk3 target pistol and a knife. The pistol was a semi-automatic weapon, not a high-powered assault rifle, but lethal nonetheless. He had taken the gun from his uncle's house the day before. The premeditation was quiet and personal. There was no manifesto sent to the police, no video uploaded to YouTube declaring his intentions to the world. There was only the silent decision made in the privacy of his own mind and the theft of the weapon that would transform him from a troubled teen into a murderer. He did not immediately draw the weapon. He sat at a table, not far from the group of boys who would soon become his victims. He waited. Witnesses would later recall seeing him sitting there, looking normal, perhaps a bit intense, but not out of place. He was part of the furniture of the morning routine. The terrifying aspect of the outlier in a small town is how easily they blend into the fabric of the community until the moment they tear it apart. Lane watched the students around him, the laughter, the normalcy. The cafeteria was loud, filled with the roar of hundreds of conversations bouncing off the linoleum floors and cinder block walls. It was a sound of life, of a future being built one day at a time. For Lane, however, the noise seemed to be a trigger, or perhaps just the backdrop for a script he had already written. The quiet town narrative relies on the assumption that everyone plays by the same social contract. We do not hurt each other. We protect our children. We value life. Lane had stepped outside of that contract long before he entered the building that morning. His alienation had calcified into a nihilistic urge to destroy. The outlier does not just stand apart from the crowd, he views the crowd with contempt. As the clock ticked toward 7:30 a.m., the gap between the mundane reality of Chardon High and the violent fantasy of T.J. Lane closed. He stood up. The motion was likely unnoticed by most. In a room full of teenagers constantly moving, standing up is not an event. He walked toward the table where Daniel Parmerter, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin were seated along with others. He did not scream. He did not announce his cause. He simply raised the .22 caliber pistol. The gun, designed for target practice, for shooting paper circles at a range, was now pointed at the backs of human heads. The horror of the moment lay in its silence before the noise. 1 second, it was a Monday morning in a safe town where nothing bad ever happens. The next second, the illusion of safety was shattered by the sharp crack of gunfire. The transition from the quiet town to the scene of a massacre was instantaneous. Lane fired 10 shots. The sound was distinct, a popping noise that some students initially mistook for firecrackers or a prank. But the reaction of the bodies told a different story. The physics of the event took over the chaos, the adrenaline, the flight response. But in those freezing seconds before the first trigger pull, the story was entirely about the juxtaposition. The warm, loud, trusting cafeteria and the cold, silent, calculating boy who had decided that today, Chardon would no longer be known for its maple syrup or its historic square, but for what he was about to do. He was the outlier who forced his way into the center, demanding recognition through the barrel of a gun. The quiet town was about to scream. To understand the horror that unfolded in the Chardon High School cafeteria, one must first look at the ghost who walked its hallways. Thomas Michael Lane III, known to everyone as TJ, was a figure defined by his contradictions. To some, he was a quiet, unassuming teenager who kept his head down. To others, he was a reluctant learner, a label that had already seen him transferred from the mainstream population of Chardon High to Lake Academy, an alternative school in nearby Willoughby. He was 17 years old, physically present but psychologically drifting further away from the reality his classmates inhabited. The foundation of Lane's life was fractured long before he ever picked up a weapon. His childhood was a catalogue of domestic instability, shadowed by the violent legacy of his father. Thomas Lane, Jr. was a man well known to law enforcement, with a history of incarceration for violent crimes, including assaults against women. The turbulence of his parents' relationship eventually led to TJ being placed in the custody of his maternal grandparents. In their home, life was reportedly quieter, more stable, yet the scars of his early years remained visible in his demeanor. He was often described as reserved, a boy who built walls rather than bridges. While he wasn't an outcast in the traditional sense, he had friends and was not known to be relentlessly bullied. There was a darkness growing beneath the surface that few bothered to probe. By late 2011, the quiet teenager began to broadcast the noise in his head. The warning signs were not screamed in the cafeteria or scrawled on bathroom stalls. They were typed into the digital void of social media, where they could be easily scrolled past and dismissed as teenage angst. On the 30th of December 2011, 2 months before the tragedy, Lane posted a rambling, chilling manifesto to his Facebook page. It was a text that would later be dissected by psychologists and profilers, searching for the moment the boy became the killer. He wrote in a poetic, archaic style, framing himself as something other than human. "In a quaint, lonely town sits a man with a frown," the post began, seemingly describing his own isolation. But the prose quickly descended into violent grandeur. He wrote of a Holy Ghost and a renovator, adopting a persona of divine judgment. The most disturbing passage, later dubbed his philosophy of death, revealed a mind fixated on destruction. "I am death, and you have always been the sod," he wrote. "Now, feel death, not just mocking you, not just stalking you, but inside of you. Wriggle and writhe. Feel smaller beneath my might." The post concluded with a directive that left little room for interpretation. "Die, all of you." In the ecosystem of high school social media, where hyperbole is a second language, the post was largely ignored. It was just TJ being weird, or TJ trying to be creative. No police were called. No school counselors were alerted. The post sat on his timeline, a public declaration of intent that dissolved into the feed, buried under photos of weekend parties and status updates about homework. Lane continued to attend school, continued to wait for the bus, and continued to exist in the periphery of his classmates' lives, all while the philosophy of death hardened into a plan. As February 2012 drew to a close, the abstract violence of his writing began to manifest in the physical world. Lane did not own a firearm, but he knew where to find one. Sometime during the weekend before the shooting, he visited his uncle's house. There, he located a .22 caliber Ruger Mk3 semi-automatic pistol. It was a target pistol, not a weapon of war, but in the hands of someone who had declared himself death, it was sufficient. He took the gun, along with 2 magazines, and concealed them. The theft went unnoticed. The weapon was now in the possession of a boy who had already written the eulogy for his town. Monday, the 27th of February, 2012, began like any other winter morning in Chardon, Ohio. It was cold, the sky a flat gray. Lane prepared for his day with a terrifying casualness. He packed his backpack, but instead of textbooks or homework, he loaded the Ruger and a knife. He dressed in a gray t-shirt with black text, over which he wore a plaid button-down and a dark vest. He headed to the bus stop, a routine he had performed countless times. Because Lane attended Lake Academy, his morning routine involved a transfer. He would take a bus to Chardon High School, wait in the cafeteria, and then board a second bus to the alternative school in Willoughby. This transfer window placed him in the heart of Chardon High every morning, surrounded by the very students he had ostensibly been separated from. When he arrived at Chardon High that morning, the cafeteria was already buzzing. It was the social hub of the school, filled with students eating breakfast, finishing homework, and waiting for the first bell. Lane entered the space, but he did not drift to the periphery as he usually might. He walked into the noise and the life of the room. He carried his backpack, the weight of the steel inside it pressing against him. He sat down at a table. He was not alone. He sat near students he knew, some of whom attended the Auburn Career Center and were also waiting for transfers. To the casual observer, nothing was amiss. He was just another student in a hoodie and vest, waiting for the next phase of his day. But T.J. Lane was not waiting for a bus. He was waiting for the right moment to execute the final line of his December manifesto. Around him, the mundane conversations of teenagers filled the air. There was laughter, the rustle of snack wrappers, the scraping of chairs against the linoleum floor. Lane sat amidst it all, a silent observer in a world he had already decided to destroy. He watched the faces of his peers, Daniel Parmurter, Russell King Jr., Demetrius Hewlin boys who had their own futures, their own plans for the weekend, their own lives that had nothing to do with Lane's dark philosophy. The warning signs had been missed. The Facebook post had been scrolled past. The stolen gun had not been missed. The systems designed to catch a falling child had failed, or perhaps Lane had simply slipped through the cracks they couldn't cover. He reached into his bag. The pestilence he had written about was no longer a metaphor. He wrapped his hand around the grip of the Ruger. The time for writing was over. The digital clock on the cafeteria wall ticked toward 7:30 a.m. The vast room, filled with hundreds of students, operated on a rhythmic hum of social stratification and morning lethargy. At the table near the center of the room, the group of boys waiting for the bus to the Auburn Career Center remained seated, their backpacks slung over shoulders or resting on the linoleum, ready for the imminent departure. T.J. Lane sat among them, not as a participant in their collective morning ritual, but as a silent orchestrator of its end. He did not speak to the boys he was about to kill. The connection between them was proximity, not animosity, which made the violence that followed devoid of any heated preamble. Lane stood up. The movement was abrupt, but not frantic, lacking the nervous energy one might expect from someone about to dismantle a community. He reached into his bag. The motion mimicked the retrieval of a textbook or a bagged lunch, a gesture performed 1,000 times a day in that very room. Instead, his hand closed around the cold grip of a Ruger Mine 3.22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. It was a target pistol designed for precision on a range, characterized by a long, tapered barrel. Lane raised the weapon. He did not announce his intentions. There was no shouting, no demand for attention, no theatrical declaration of vengeance. He simply leveled the barrel at the boys sitting directly across and adjacent to him. The distance was negligible. He was close enough to touch them, close enough to see the confusion that had not yet metastasized into fear. The first trigger pull resulted in a sharp, popping sound. It was not the thunderous boom of a shotgun or the heavy crack of a high-caliber rifle. The .22 round makes a noise often compared to a firecracker or a popping balloon, a sonic detail that tragically delayed the reaction of the surrounding crowd. Students at neighboring tables glanced up, expecting to see a prank, a plastic bag bursting, or a student acting out. They did not immediately process the reality of lethal force. At the table, however, the physics of the bullet were immediate. Lane fired directly into the group, Nate Mueller, sitting near Lane, felt a sudden sharp sting graze his ear. The bullet had sliced through the cartilage, missing his skull by a fraction of an inch. The sensation was hot and stinging, but the realization of what had happened lagged behind the physical shock. Mueller looked at Lane. He saw the gun. The visual data aligned with the pain, and the instinct for survival overrode the paralysis of confusion. Mueller scrambled, diving away from the table, his mind struggling to comprehend that the quiet student he knew was methodically executing his friends. Lane continued firing. He turned his attention to Russell King Jr. The 17-year-old was seated, trapped by the furniture and the suddenness of the assault. Lane fired. The bullet struck King in the head. The injury was catastrophic and instantaneous. King slumped forward, his body losing all motor control, collapsing onto the cafeteria table. The violence was precise and clinical. Lane was not spraying the room blindly. He was selecting targets within the tight cluster of boys he had been sitting with moments prior. Daniel Parmurder, a 16-year-old computer science student waiting for the same bus, was next. He had been part of the casual morning banter just seconds before. As the reality of the gunfire registered, there was no time to flee, no time to bargain. Lane fired again. Parmurder was struck. The bullet entered his body, inflicting critical damage. He fell, his future erased in the span of a heartbeat. The chaos at the table was total, a mix of falling bodies and the desperate scrambling motion of those trying to escape the kill zone. Demetrius Hewlin, 16, was also in the line of fire. As the shooter pivoted, tracking the movement at the table, another shot rang out. Hewlin was hit. He collapsed, joining King and Parmurder on the floor of the cafeteria. In less than 10 seconds, 3 young men lay mortally wounded, their blood beginning to pool on the speckled floor, while the smell of burnt gunpowder began to drift through the stagnant air of the lunchroom. The reaction in the wider cafeteria shifted from curiosity to terror in a wave. The pop sounds continued, rhythmic and deliberate. As the students closest to the epicenter realized the source of the noise, screams began to puncture the low hum of conversation. The behavior of the crowd fractured. Some students dropped to the floor, curling into balls under the round tables, adhering to the lockdown drills practiced in the abstract. Others, driven by adrenaline, bolted. Chairs were kicked over, clattering loudly against the floor, creating a cacophony that competed with the gunfire. Backpacks were abandoned. The orderly rows of the cafeteria dissolved into a stampede of terrified teenagers pushing toward the exits. Lane did not remain stationary. With the immediate targets at his table down, he began to move. He was not running. His pace was measured, hunting. He turned his weapon toward the fleeing mass of students. The shooter's expression remained blank, a terrifying void where rage or panic should have been. He was acting out a script he had rehearsed in his mind, and the unpredictability of the crowd did not seem to deter him. Nick Walchak, 17, had reacted quickly. He was running away from the table, moving toward the safety of the hallway. Lane tracked him. The shooter extended his arm, following the trajectory of the fleeing student. He fired. Walchak was struck in the back, the bullet severing his spine. His legs instantly ceased to function, and he crashed to the floor, paralyzed. The momentum of his flight drove him downward, and he lay there, unable to move, as the shooter continued to advance. Another shot was fired into the crowd. Joy Rickers, 18, was moving away from the danger when she was hit. The bullet struck her, fracturing a bone. She fell but managed to scramble, the adrenaline masking the severity of the injury as the primal need to put distance between herself and the gunman took over. The cafeteria was now a scene of absolute bedlam. The air was filled with the shrieks of students, the crash of overturning furniture, and the distinct, rhythmic snapping of the .22 pistol. Amidst the fleeing students, one figure moved against the tide. Frank Hall, the assistant football coach and study hall monitor, was in the cafeteria when the shooting began. He was a large man, physically imposing, but his role that morning was one of supervision, not combat. When the shots rang out, Hall did not dive for cover. He did not run for the exit. He looked toward the sound and saw T.J. Lane standing amidst the fallen bodies of the students, the gun still raised. Hall's reaction was immediate and selfless. He realized that Lane was not finished. The shooter was reloading, or preparing to acquire new targets. Hall charged. He ran directly at the gunman, shouting, making himself the largest, most obvious target in the room. His voice boomed over the screams, a challenge intended to draw Lane's focus away from the vulnerable students. Lane turned. He saw the coach bearing down on him. The dynamic of the shooting shifted instantly. Lane had been the predator acting upon unsuspecting prey. Now, he was being hunted. The blank determination that had characterized the massacre fractured. Faced with an adult who was actively engaging him, Lane did not stand his ground. He did not fire at Hall. The psychological dominance he held over the room evaporated. Lane lowered the weapon and ran. He sprinted toward the exit doors, moving with a desperate speed that contrasted with his earlier methodical pacing. Hall did not stop. He pursued the shooter, chasing him out of the cafeteria and down the hallway. The chase was short but critical. It forced Lane to abandon the killing floor, preventing him from firing the remaining rounds in his magazine into the huddled masses of students hiding under tables. As Lane burst through the exit doors and into the cold February morning, fleeing the school grounds, Hall stopped at the threshold. He made a split-second calculation. The shooter was gone, leaving the campus, but the victims inside were dying. Hall turned back. He returned to the cafeteria, a room that had transformed from a place of breakfast and gossip into an abattoir. The silence that followed the shooter's exit was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded and the sobbing of those who had witnessed the execution of their classmates. The scene Hall returned to was devastating. Russell King Jr. lay unresponsive. Daniel Parmenter was critically injured, his breathing shallow. Demetrius Hewlin was fighting for his life. Nick Walchak lay paralyzed on the floor, conscious but unable to rise. Teachers and staff, who had initially frozen or ushered students to safety, now rushed to the fallen boys. They used paper napkins, clothing, and bare hands to apply pressure to the wounds. The bright fluorescent lights of the cafeteria illuminated the stark reality of the violence. There was no cinematic glory, only the messy, tragic physiology of gunshot wounds. The smell of copper blood mixed with the lingering scent of cafeteria food. Outside the school, the sirens began to wail, a distant chorus growing louder, signaling the arrival of a world that had been irrevocably altered. Inside, the timeline of the shooting had lasted only a few minutes, but for the students of Chardon High, the trauma had carved a permanent divide between the life they knew before 7:30 a.m. and the reality they now inhabited. The shooter was gone, disappearing into the woods, but the empty seats at the table near the center of the room would remain. The manifesto had been executed. The mundane morning was over. The sirens that had begun as a distant chorus rapidly swelled into a deafening scream, converging on Chardon High School from every direction. Inside the building, the threat had vanished from the cafeteria, but the danger had simply relocated. The shooter, 17-year-old T.J. Lane, had not surrendered his weapon amidst the carnage he created. Instead, he had turned his back on the devastation and fled. The catalyst for his flight was assistant football coach Frank Hall. In the seconds following the initial volley of gunfire, while students dove for cover or froze in shock, Hall had made a split-second decision that likely saved countless lives. Disregarding his own safety, the large-statured coach did not retreat. He charged. As Lane scanned the room for more targets, he saw the 300-pound figure of Hall barreling toward him. The predator instantly became the prey. Lane turned and sprinted toward the exit doors, his sneakers squeaking against the linoleum as he scrambled to put distance between himself and the teacher pursuing him. Hall chased Lane through the corridor, shouting at him to stop, acting as a human shield for any students remaining in the hallway. Lane burst through the school's double doors and out into the biting February air of Ohio. Hall followed him to the threshold but stopped at the exit. He was unarmed, and pursuing an active shooter into an open parking lot or the surrounding woods presented a tactical disadvantage that could lead to further loss of life if the gunman decided to turn and fire. Hall watched as Lane sprinted across the asphalt, heading away from the school building and toward the dense tree line that bordered the property. The shooter was loose, armed, and moving into the community. The call went out over the radio frequencies of the Geauga County Sheriff's Office and the Chardon Police Department. Active shooter. Suspect fled on foot. The descriptions were frantic but consistent. A white male, juvenile, dark hair, wearing a gray t-shirt and a vest. The tranquility of the small town of Chardon was shattered as law enforcement units from surrounding jurisdictions flooded the zone. The priority shifted immediately from containment of the school to a full-scale manhunt. The geography of the area complicated the pursuit. Chardon is situated in a semi-rural landscape characterized by patches of dense woods, rolling fields, and residential neighborhoods. It was a terrain that offered ample hiding spots for a fugitive. The weather was typical for late winter in northeast Ohio, cold, gray, and stark. The trees were bare, their skeletal branches offering no canopy to obscure the ground from aerial surveillance. But the thick underbrush and the uneven topography provided cover for anyone willing to crawl or lie still. Law enforcement established a perimeter rapidly. Cruisers blocked the intersections, their lights flashing against the morning gloom. Officers armed with rifles took up positions along the roadways, scanning the tree lines and the backyards of homes adjacent to the school. The lockdown order rippled outward, affecting not just Chardon High but the nearby elementary and middle schools. Parents who had rushed to the scene were held back at the perimeter, their anxiety palpable as they waited for news, knowing the shooter was still somewhere in the silence of the woods. Tracking teams, including K-9 units, were deployed to the point where Lane was last seen. The dogs picked up the scent near the cafeteria exit, pulling their handlers across the pavement and into the rougher terrain beyond. The officers moved methodically, their weapons drawn, sweeping the area in a formation designed to prevent an ambush. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig was a potential threat. They did not know if Lane intended to escape, if he planned to commit suicide, or if he was setting up a vantage point to engage the police. Information began to flow from the school to the command post. Witnesses identified the shooter as T.J. Lane. This allowed police to quickly pull up records and identifying information, distributing his photograph to the agents in the field. The ambiguity of an unknown subject was replaced by a specific target. The search radius expanded, pushing outward from the high school toward Wooden Road, a thoroughfare that cut through the wooded and residential areas north of the campus. Approximately an hour had passed since the first shot was fired. The tension in the air was thick, fed by the uncertainty of Lane's location. Then, at around 8:40 a.m., a breakthrough came. A Geauga County Sheriff's deputy, John Belichick, along with Sergeant Mike Warner, was patrolling the perimeter near Wooden Road, roughly a mile from the school. They were scanning the area where the woods met the road, looking for any movement that didn't fit the morning routine. Deputy Belichick spotted a lone figure standing near a vehicle parked by the side of the road. The individual matched the description broadcast over the radio. A young white male, dark hair, wearing a gray t-shirt. He was not running. He was not brandishing the weapon. He was simply standing there, eerily calm amidst the chaos he had ignited. The deputy stopped his cruiser and exited, his weapon drawn and trained on the suspect. The confrontation was tense but brief. Belichick shouted commands, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Let me see your hands. Get down on the ground." There was a moment where the outcome hung in the balance. A decision point where the suspect could choose to escalate the violence or submit. Lane did not run. He did not reach for a waistband. He slowly raised his hands and lowered himself to the slushy ground. As officers moved in to secure him, the reality of the capture set in. Lane was handcuffed without a struggle. The adrenaline that fueled the chase began to ebb, replaced by the procedural rigor of an arrest. The officers conducted a hasty pat-down for weapons. They did not find the gun on his person. "Where is the gun?" they demanded. Lane, whose demeanor was described by the arresting officers as disturbingly quiet and detached, indicated that he had discarded it. A search of the immediate vicinity was launched. A short distance away, officers located the weapon, a Ruger Mach 3 .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. Alongside the firearm, they found a knife. The tools of the violence had been abandoned in the woods, just as Lane had abandoned his victims on the cafeteria floor. Lane was hoisted to his feet and placed in the back of the police cruiser. He was wearing a t-shirt that had "Killer" handwritten across the front, though reports at the scene varied on whether this was immediately visible or obscured by his outer layers at the moment of arrest. Regardless of the clothing, his identity was confirmed. The radio waves crackled with the message that everyone had been waiting for. Suspect in custody. The capture of T.J. Lane brought an end to the immediate physical danger, but it marked the beginning of the investigative forensic process. The crime scene at the school was locked down, and now a secondary crime scene, the path of his flight, and the location of his arrest had to be processed. Crime scene technicians arrived to document the location of the discarded weapon, photographing it in situ before carefully collecting it for ballistics testing. They retraced Lane's steps from the school doors to the capture site, looking for any other discarded evidence or indicators of his mindset during the flight. Lane was transported to the Chardon police station for processing and interrogation. The ride was short. During the transport and the initial booking, Lane remained withdrawn. He did not exhibit the manic energy often associated with violent offenders immediately after a crime, nor did he show the weeping remorse of someone who had just realized the gravity of their actions. He was flat. His pulse, his breathing, his speech, everything was controlled. Back at the high school, the all clear allowed emergency teams to fully access the building, transitioning the operation from active shooter response to mass casualty management and evidence collection. But out on Wooden Road, the silence returned to the woods. The K9s were crated, the rifles were lowered, and the perimeter tape was strung up. The chase was over. The physical pursuit had lasted less than 90 minutes, but the questions it raised would take years to unravel. The boy who had fled the cafeteria was now a prisoner, sitting in an interrogation room, waiting to tell a story that would defy comprehension. The transition of Chardon High School from a center of education to a regulated crime scene was immediate and absolute. As the ambulances departed and the perimeter hardened, the interior of the cafeteria became the domain of forensic investigators. The sprawling room, usually filled with the cacophony of teenage morning routines, sat in an eerie, suspended silence. Abandoned backpacks, half-eaten breakfasts, and open textbooks remained exactly where they had been dropped, freezing the moment of impact in a chaotic tableau. The primary objective for the Geauga County Sheriff's Office and the assisting Bureau of Criminal Investigation agents was to reconstruct the timeline using the physical remnants of the violence. The most critical component of this reconstruction lay in the surveillance system. The school was equipped with a network of security cameras, and the footage from the cafeteria became the definitive, silent witness to the morning's events. Investigators reviewed the digital files, watching the timeline unspool with agonizing clarity. The footage showed T.J. Lane arriving at the school, not as an intruder breaking in, but as a figure blending into the environment. He was a student at Lake Academy, an alternative school, but waited at Chardon High for a bus transfer. The video time-stamped his movements, showing him entering the cafeteria and selecting a seat. He did not appear agitated. For nearly 20 minutes, the camera captured him sitting at a table, seemingly mundane and innocuous. He was surrounded by other students, yet separated by a psychological gulf that the low-resolution video could not capture, but clearly suggested through his body language. He sat alone. The forensic analysis of the video allowed detectives to pinpoint the exact moment the dynamic shifted. At approximately 7:30 a.m., Lane stood up. The footage confirmed the premeditation that prosecutors would later highlight. He did not snap in the middle of a confrontation. There was no argument, no shouting match, and no physical altercation that precipitated the violence. He simply rose from his seat, reached into his backpack, and produced the weapon. The video captured the mechanical efficiency of his actions. He raised the firearm and began shooting immediately. The surveillance confirmed the sequence of victims, correlating with the positioning of the bodies and the injured. It showed the randomness of his initial aim and the targeted nature of his follow-through. The entire active shooting duration was brief, a matter of seconds that irrevocably altered the trajectory of the community before he turned and fled the building. While the video provided the visual narrative, The physical evidence on the floor told the ballistic story. Crime scene technicians placed yellow numbered markers next to each spent shell casing. There were 10 markers in total. This number was significant. It indicated that Lane had emptied the magazine. The weapon was not fired until it jammed or until he was subdued. It was fired until it was empty. The casings were small brass cylinders, evidence of a .22 caliber rimfire ammunition. The weapon itself was recovered shortly after Lane's apprehension. It was a Ruger Mk3 .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol. This specific firearm is typically associated with target shooting and small game hunting, known for its precision rather than its stopping power in combat scenarios. However, the forensic pathology reports would later confirm that the small caliber, when directed at close range toward vital areas, was devastatingly lethal. The bullet's lower velocity often caused it to ricochet internally rather than exiting, maximizing the trauma to the victims. Tracing the provenance of the Ruger Mk3 became a secondary line of inquiry for the detectives. Lane was a minor and could not legally purchase a handgun. The serial number trace and subsequent interviews revealed that the gun belonged to his uncle. Lane had spent the weekend at his grandparents' house, where his uncle also resided. Sometime during that stay, Lane had accessed the weapon. He had concealed it, along with 2 fully loaded magazines, and transported it to school. The theft of the firearm added a layer of calculation to the crime. This was not a weapon of opportunity found at the scene, but a tool procured specifically for this purpose. In addition to the firearm, investigators cataloged a knife found in Lane's possession, a serrated blade that went unused but spoke to a mindset prepared for violence. As the physical evidence was being bagged and tagged at the high school, a different kind of evidence was being gathered at the Geauga County Safety Center. T.J. Lane was seated in an interrogation room. The environment was stark, a windowless box designed to elicit truth through isolation. Lane sat across from the detectives, stripped of the weapon and the chaos he had orchestrated. The recording of the interrogation provided a glimpse into the shooter's psyche that was as disturbing as the surveillance footage. Detectives expected resistance, or perhaps the manic defense of a teenager realizing his life was effectively over. Instead, they encountered a chilling detachment. Lane waived his Miranda rights. He agreed to speak. His demeanor was quiet, his voice steady. He did not scream, he did not cry, and he did not ask for a lawyer. When asked about the events of the morning, Lane did not deny them. He provided a confession that was terrifying in its simplicity. He admitted to taking the gun. He admitted to bringing it to school. He admitted to waiting for the bus and then choosing to open fire. The detectives pressed for the motive, the question that plagued the families and the community: why? Lane's responses were void of the typical grievances associated with school shootings. He did not cite bullying. He did not claim he was targeting a specific ex-girlfriend or a rival. He did not offer a manifesto or a political ideology. When asked why he chose those specific students, Daniel Parmurter, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin Lane, simply stated that he did not know them. He claimed the victims were random. He was sitting at a table, he saw them, and he decided to shoot. The transcript of the interview highlighted the arbitrary nature of the violence. Lane described aiming for heads. He acknowledged that he was trying to kill people. There was no ambiguity in his intent. At one point in the questioning, when pressed again on the reason for the attack, he offered a sentiment that would haunt the investigation: "I don't know." He possessed the clarity to describe the mechanics of the shooting, how he held the gun, how he pulled the trigger, but offered a vacuum regarding the emotional or logical reasoning behind it. He admitted to wearing a t-shirt with the word "killer" scrawled on it under his dress shirt, a detail that would gain infamy later, but in the interrogation room, the focus was on his verbal admissions. He told the police that he had killed them all, a statement that was factually incorrect at the time, as some victims were fighting for their lives in the hospital, but psychologically revealing. In his mind, the act was total. He had set out to destroy, and he believed he had succeeded. The investigators delved into his history, looking for red flags that might explain the detachment. They asked about his home life, his time at the alternative school, and his social circle. Lane provided brief factual answers but showed no emotional connection to the tragedy he had just caused. He did not inquire about the condition of the students he had shot. He did not express regret. The confession was technical, not emotional. It was a confirmation of facts rather than an unburdening of a guilty conscience. This confession, combined with the surveillance video and the recovered weapon, formed an ironclad evidentiary triangle. The prosecution did not need to rely on circumstantial evidence or witness identification. They had the shooter on video, they had the murder weapon linked to him by possession and theft, and they had his own voice detailing the crime on tape. The swiftness of the investigation was propelled by this abundance of indisputable proof. Within hours of the shooting, the narrative of who and how was completely resolved. The why, however, remained buried in the flat affect of a 17-year-old boy who sat in a police station and calmly explained how he had executed his classmates. The gathered evidence was compiled into a comprehensive report. The 10 shell casings were matched to the Ruger Mk3. The autopsy reports for Parmenter, King, and later Hewlin were correlated with the trajectory analysis from the crime scene. The confession was transcribed and verified. As the sun set on Chardon, Ohio, the legal framework for the prosecution was already cemented. The boy who had sat quietly in the cafeteria, waiting for the right moment to destroy lives, was now a defendant in a capital murder case, shielded by neither anonymity nor doubt. The silence of the interrogation room had sealed his fate long before he would ever step foot in a courtroom. The conclusion of the investigative phase brought a swift transition to the legal proceedings. With the physical evidence locked away and the forensic timeline established, the Geauga County justice system prepared to process the magnitude of the tragedy. There was no mystery regarding the identity of the shooter, nor was there any ambiguity regarding his actions. The remaining questions were procedural, centering on how T.J. Lane would plead and what penalty the state of Ohio would extract for the lives of Daniel Parmenter, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin. On the 26th of February 2013, exactly one day prior to the one-year anniversary of the massacre, Lane stood before Judge David Fury and entered a plea of guilty to 3 counts of aggravated murder, 2 counts of attempted aggravated murder, and felonious assault. By accepting the plea, the defense bypassed the spectacle of a lengthy trial, a decision that initially offered a semblance of relief to a community still nursing raw wounds. There would be no jury selection, no weeks of testimony replaying the chaotic minutes in the cafeteria, and no cross-examination of the survivors who were trying to rebuild their lives. The legal mechanism moved directly to the sentencing phase. Because Lane was 17 at the time of the offense, the death penalty was off the table due to Supreme Court rulings regarding juvenile offenders. The maximum penalty available to the court was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for the morning of the 19th of March 2013. The Geauga County Courthouse in Chardon became the focal point for national media, yet the atmosphere inside the courtroom was intensely local and suffocatingly personal. The gallery was packed with the families of the deceased, the survivors, and a community representative of the student body. The air was heavy with an expectation of closure, mixed with the dread of confronting the young man who had shattered their sense of safety. Lane entered the courtroom, flanked by sheriff's deputies. He was dressed in a standard blue button-down dress shirt and dark slacks. His hair was cropped short, and his demeanor appeared relaxed, almost detached from the gravity of the proceedings. He sat beside his defense attorney, Ian Friedman, who had the unenviable task of representing a client who had not only confessed, but seemed indifferent to his own fate. As the hearing commenced, the contrast between the defendant's casual posture and the palpable grief of the gallery created an immediate tension. The prosecution, led by Geauga County Prosecutor James Flays, began by outlining the devastating impact of the crime. Flays did not dwell on the ballistics or the tactical movements, as those were already matter of record. Instead, he focused on the void left in Chardon. To illustrate the depth of the loss, the court invited the families of the victims to deliver impact statements. This portion of the hearing was intended to be the emotional core of the day, a chance for the bereaved to speak directly to the court and, inevitably, to the killer. Dina Parmerter, the mother of Daniel Parmerter, approached the podium first. Her grief was visceral. She spoke of the physical pain of losing a child, describing it as a sickness that never abated. She addressed the monster in the room directly, refusing to say his name, calling him a pathetic excuse for a human being. She expressed her wish that he would suffer for the rest of his life, tormented by the same darkness he had inflicted upon them. Throughout her statement, cameras trained on the defense table caught Lane's reaction. There was no head bowed in shame, no stoic acceptance of guilt. Lane looked around the room, his eyes darting, and a faint, unsettling smile played on his lips. The courtroom watched in disturbed silence as Lane's behavior became increasingly erratic. As Bob Parmerter, Daniel's father, took the stand to describe the agony of seeing his son in the morgue, Lane swiveled in his chair. He seemed to be suppressing laughter. The disconnect between the anguish being poured out by the father and the amusement visible on the defendant's face sent a ripple of shock through the observers. It was not merely a lack of remorse, it was an active mockery of the proceedings. Holly Walchak, the mother of Nick Walchak, who had been paralyzed by Lane's bullets, spoke next. She detailed the permanent struggles her son faced, the wheelchair that was now his reality, and the stole future of a vibrant young man. She spoke of forgiveness being impossible in the face of such unrepentant evil. Again, Lane smirked. He whispered to his counsel, who remained professional but appeared visibly tense. It became clear to those in the front rows that the defense attorney was struggling to contain his client. When the family of Russell King Jr. spoke, the emotional temperature in the room reached its peak. They spoke of a kind, generous boy whose life was stolen over nothing. They spoke of the empty chair at the dinner table and the silence in their home. The devastation was absolute. Yet, the young man at the defense table treated the moment as if it were a farce. He looked at the family members with a gaze that was described by witnesses as chillingly empty, void of any human empathy. After the families had finished, and the prosecutor had requested the maximum consecutive sentences, the procedural rhythm shifted to the defense. Ian Friedman rose. He had a professional obligation to advocate for his client, but he was limited by Lane's own instructions. Friedman noted that Lane had deeply guarded the reasons for his actions, and that the defense would not be presenting witnesses or evidence in mitigation. It was a stark admission. There was no defense to offer, no psychological context that Lane wanted to share, no plea for mercy. Judge Fury then turned his attention to the defendant. In accordance with procedure, Lane was offered the opportunity to make a statement before the sentence was handed down. In most capital murder cases or life sentence hearings, this is the moment where defendants either maintain their innocence, offer an apology, or stand silent. T.J. Lane stood up. He looked briefly at his attorney, then turned to face the gallery where the families of the boys he killed were sitting. He reached for the buttons of his blue dress shirt. For a brief second there was confusion. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. Lane undid the buttons and pulled the dress shirt open, letting it slide off his shoulders. Underneath, he was wearing a white t-shirt. Across the front, scrawled in large, jagged black marker, was the word killer. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The audacity of the display was paralyzing. Before the bailiffs could react or the judge could intervene, Lane broke his silence. He did not speak to the judge. He looked directly at the parents of Daniel, Russell, and Demetrius. He smirked, his face contorting into a sneer of pure malice. "This hand that pulled the trigger that killed your sons now masturbates to the memory," Lane announced, his voice steady and loud enough to reach the back of the room. He then raised his middle finger to the families. "Fuck all of you." The courtroom erupted in a mix of gasps and stifled cries of rage. The shock was absolute. Prosecutor Flaez looked on in disbelief. The families who had just poured out their hearts, hoping to see some flicker of humanity, were instead met with a grotesque celebration of their loss. Lane stood there, the word killer emblazoned on his chest, smiling with a sense of triumph. He had turned his sentencing hearing into a final act of psychological violence. Judge Fury, a veteran of the bench, remained outwardly composed, though the severity of his expression deepened. He did not shout. He did not order Lane to be gagged. He allowed the moment to hang in the air, letting the defendant's actions speak more loudly than any prosecutor's argument ever could. The display lasted only moments, but the image of Lane in the white t-shirt flipping off the grieving families was instantly burned into the history of the case. Lane sat back down, leaning back in his chair with an air of satisfaction. The defense attorney, Friedman, looked down, his job now reduced to a mere formality. There was nothing left to say. Lane had confirmed every fear the community held. This was not a tragic accident or a moment of madness, but a calculated act of hatred that the perpetrator enjoyed. Judge Fury proceeded to deliver the sentence. He began by addressing the spectacle the court had just witnessed. He noted that in all his years on the bench, he had never seen such a display of defiance and lack of remorse. He stated that the defendant's actions in the courtroom were proof that he was not only dangerous, but completely beyond the reach of rehabilitation. The smile, the shirt, the obscenity, it all served as the final pieces of evidence. The judge characterized the crime as a merciless, random, premeditated execution. He dismantled any notion that Lane was a victim of bullying or circumstance, citing the investigation's findings that Lane had prepared for the shooting with a cold rationality. He noted that Lane had brought a knife to school the day before the shooting, and the gun the day of, proving sustained intent. Addressing the killer shirt specifically, Judge Fury remarked on the chilling nature of a young man who would wear such a label as a badge of honor. He noted that Lane clearly craved the notoriety, that he wanted to be known as a monster. The judge refused to grant him the dignity of being misunderstood. He was simply a murderer. Fury then pronounced the sentence. For the aggravated murder of Daniel Parmenter, T.J. Lane was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the aggravated murder of Russell King Jr., life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the aggravated murder of Demetrius Hewlin, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge ordered that these sentences be served consecutively. Lane would not serve one life term. He would serve 3, one after the other, ensuring that even if laws changed or clemency was ever considered decades in the future, he would never walk free. Additionally, for the attempted murders and felonious assaults on the survivors, the judge added another 37 years to the sentence. Throughout the reading of the sentence, Lane rocked back and forth in his chair. He smiled at the floor. He smiled at the deputies. When the judge finished, Lane offered no further outbursts. The performance he had orchestrated was complete. He had delivered his lines, revealed his costume, and received his review in the form of a sentence that would see him die in a concrete cell. The deputies moved in immediately to shackle him. As they pulled him to his feet, the killer shirt was visible one last time to the cameras and the families. He was led out of the courtroom through a side door, still smirking. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, sealing him away from the society he had attacked. The aftermath in the courtroom was a stunned silence, followed by the slow, painful release of breath. The families embraced, tears flowing freely, but the nature of their tears had changed. The sorrow was still there, vast and crushing, but it was now mixed with a fresh trauma. They had come for justice, and while they received the maximum legal penalty the state could offer, they had been denied the spiritual closure of seeing the killer humbled. Instead, they had been forced to witness him revel in their pain. Prosecutor Flays spoke to the media shortly after the hearing concluded. He expressed his disgust, noting that Lane's actions proved he was a disgusting human being. He emphasized that the preparation required to wear that shirt writing on it beforehand, wearing it under his dress clothes, waiting for the precise moment to reveal, it demonstrated the same level of premeditation that went into the shooting itself. It was a second attack, launched from the defense table. The legal outcome was final. T.J. Lane was now inmate number A640654. He was transported immediately to the Lorain Correctional Institution to begin processing before his permanent placement in a maximum security facility. The case was legally closed. The appeals process would be practically non-existent given the guilty plea. But the image of the boy in the white shirt, smiling as he flipped off the parents of the dead, lingered like a toxic vapor over Chardon. The court had done its job, locking the physical threat away, but the psychological wound inflicted during those final 5 minutes of the hearing would take years to scar over. The killer's shirt became the defining symbol of the trial, a testament to the hollowness of the young man who wore it, and the absolute necessity of the life sentence he had just been handed. The placement of T.J. Lane within the Ohio penal system became a subject of immediate scrutiny following his sentencing. Despite the severity of his crimes and the erratic behavior displayed in the courtroom, he was eventually assigned to the Allen Oakwood Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio. This was a medium-security facility, a decision justified by prison officials, citing Lane's age and his need for protective custody. He was housed in the Oakwood Unit, a section separated from the general population, designed to keep high-profile or vulnerable inmates safe. However, the designation of medium security implied a level of trust and containment that would soon prove disastrously insufficient. On the evening of the 11th of September 2014, 18 months after he smirked at the families of his victims, Lane orchestrated a breach of the facility's perimeter. He was not alone. He had conspired with 2 other inmates in the protective custody unit. Clifford Opperud, a 45-year-old serving time for aggravated robbery and burglary, and Lindsay Bruce, a 33-year-old convicted of murder. The trio had identified a structural weakness in the recreation yard, a blind spot in the facility's architecture that allowed them access to a crawl space. At approximately 7:38 p.m., the 3 inmates slipped through the crawl space, which led them to the roof of an administrative building. From that vantage point, they improvised a ladder to scale the perimeter fence. The escape was not high-tech, nor was it particularly sophisticated. It was a brute force exploitation of lax supervision and physical decay. Once over the fence, the 3 men split up, disappearing into the cornfields and wooded areas surrounding the prison. The alarm was raised, and the serenity of the rural Ohio evening was shattered by sirens. News of the escape traveled instantly to Chardon, nearly 150 miles away. For the families of Daniel Parmurter, Russell King Jr., and Demetrius Hewlin, and for the surviving victims and the student body, the notification was a psychological hammer blow. The closure they had begun to cultivate following the trial evaporated. Local law enforcement in Chardon immediately mobilized, placing officers outside the homes of the victims' families and closing the Chardon local school district for the following day. The fear was irrational but palpable. Logically, Lane was on foot hours away, but emotionally, the monster was loose, and the sanctuary of the community felt violated for a second time. The manhunt in Lima was massive and aggressive. The Ohio State Highway Patrol, local police, and canine units scoured the perimeter. Lindsay Bruce was captured quickly, almost immediately after clearing the fence. Lane, however, managed to evade the initial perimeter sweep. For 5 hours, the killer roamed the darkness, armed with a pitchfork he had scavenged from a nearby property. The image of the unrepentant school shooter loose in the community dominated national news, reopening the national conversation about prison security and the management of youthful violent offenders. At 1:20 a.m., the search ended. A patrol officer spotted Lane sitting near a church, roughly 100 yards from the prison grounds. He did not fight. He did not run. He surrendered without incident. When officers approached him, the arrogance that defined his courtroom demeanor was absent. He was wet, cold, and compliant. The pitchfork lay nearby, unused. The third escapee, Clifford Opperud, was apprehended 3 hours later, found hiding under a boat on a private property. The fallout from the escape was swift and administrative. The warden of Allen Oakwood was removed, and an internal investigation revealed a catalog of security failures, including ignored work orders regarding the security breach points and complacency among the guard staff. T.J. Lane's status was immediately upgraded. He was transferred to the Ohio State Penitentiary in Youngstown, a super-maximum security facility known for housing the state's most dangerous offenders. There, he was placed in a single cell for 23 hours a day, his interactions with the world reduced to a sliver. The escape attempt had stripped him of the relative comfort of protective custody and landed him in a concrete environment designed to extinguish hope. While Lane was locked away in Youngstown, The community of Chardon continued the slow, agonizing work of living with the scars he had inflicted. The legacy of the shooting was written on the bodies of the survivors. Nick Waljak, who had been shot in the spine, faced a life confined to a wheelchair. His journey became a testament to resilience, but also a daily reminder of the physical permanency of the violence. The One Heartbeat slogan, born in the days following the tragedy, evolved from a rallying cry into a quiet endurance. The emotional scars proved just as indelible. Frank Hall, the assistant football coach who had chased Lane out of the cafeteria and undoubtedly saved lives, grappled with the complex burden of being hailed as a hero while mourning the boys he couldn't save. The anniversaries of February 27 became somber milestones. The high school remodeled the cafeteria, erasing the physical evidence of the crime scene, but the memory of the space remained charged with the trauma of that morning. The families of the deceased channeled their grief into foundations and scholarships, determined that the names Daniel, Russell, and Demetrius would be associated with benevolence rather than tragedy. They attended the parole hearings for the other escapees, ensuring that the system that failed to keep Lane in check did not fail again. The escape in 2014 had served as a cruel reminder that the justice system ends at the prison gate, but the victim's sentence lasts a lifetime. Ultimately, the narrative of Chardon shifted away from the shooter, T.J. Lane became a ghost in the machine of the Ohio corrections system, a number in a high-security cell, stripped of his audience and his ability to harm. He had sought infamy through a shirt and a gesture, but time eroded his relevance. The true legacy of the event was found in the quiet fortitude of a town that refused to be defined by his anger. The scars remained visible, woven into the fabric of the community, but they had healed over, turning from open wounds into marks of survival. The story of Chardon High School ceased to be about the boy who wanted to be a killer, and became entirely about the people who refused to let him destroy them.